Ed Sullivan burst through the dressing room door at CBS Studio 50, following the panicked calls of Elvis Presley's bodyguards who had been trying to wake the king of rock and roll for the past 10 minutes. It was June 5, 1977, just 2 months before Elvis would die in his bathroom at Graceland, and what Ed discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elvis was slumped over in his chair, his famous white jumpsuit stained with sweat and what appeared to be vomit, his breathing shallow and irregular. Bottles of prescription pills were scattered across the dressing room table like confetti at a funeral. This wasn't the charismatic young man who had electrified America 20 years earlier. Before you hear this tragic story, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to witness is how Ed Sullivan watched one of America's greatest entertainers slowly kill himself and tried desperately to save him. To understand why Ed Sullivan was so horrified by what he found in Elvis's dressing room, you need to understand how far the king of rock and roll had fallen by June 1977, and how the entertainment industry had systematically failed to protect one of its greatest stars from self-destruction. Elvis wasn't just another aging performer struggling with the pressures of fame. He was a man who had been systematically destroyed by prescription drug addiction, isolation, and the crushing weight of being Elvis Presley 24 hours a day for over 2 decades. The Elvis that Ed discovered unconscious in 1977 bore little resemblance to the young, dynamic performer who had revolutionized American music in the 1950s and become a global cultural phenomenon. That Elvis had been lean, energetic, and radiating sexuality and rebellion that challenged every social convention of his time. This Elvis was overweight, pale, bloated, and dependent on a cocktail of prescription medications that included painkillers, sleeping pills, and stimulants that were slowly poisoning his system and destroying his mind. The transformation had been gradual but relentless. Elvis's prescription drug use had begun innocently enough during his army service in the late 1950s, when military doctors had prescribed amphetamines to help him stay alert during long duties. But what started as legitimate medical treatment had evolved into a dangerous dependency that was enabled and encouraged by a medical establishment that treated Elvis's celebrity status as more important than his health and safety. Ed had known Elvis since his first controversial appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, when Elvis had been criticized for his hip movements and sexual energy that scandalized conservative America. Over the years, Ed had watched Elvis become the biggest entertainment phenomenon in the world, selling millions of records, starring in dozens of movies, and drawing crowds that bordered on hysteria wherever he appeared. But Ed had also had a front-row seat to Elvis's gradual decline and the systematic failure of everyone around him to address his growing problems. Ed had also noticed disturbing changes in Elvis over the past 5 years that went far beyond the normal aging process or the stress of maintaining a demanding career. The performer who had once been punctual, professional, and completely in control of his performances had become increasingly unreliable, often arriving late for appearances, canceling at the last minute, or showing up in conditions that made it clear he was under the influence of something that affected his judgment and coordination. His weight had fluctuated dramatically between performances, sometimes appearing gaunt and skeletal, other times bloated and puffy in ways that suggested serious health problems. There were persistent rumors about prescription drug abuse that Elvis's management team worked desperately to suppress, threatening legal action against any media outlet that dared to report on the king's deteriorating condition. Elvis isn't the same person he used to be. Ed had confided to his wife Sylvia after Elvis's previous Sullivan Show appearance in 1975, which had been a barely controlled disaster that had left everyone involved deeply concerned. He used to have this incredible energy, this natural charisma that lit up any room he entered. He was professional, focused, and completely committed to giving audiences the best possible performance. Now he seems tired, disconnected, confused, like he's performing out of obligation rather than joy. Something is seriously wrong with him, and everyone around him is pretending not to notice. The June 1977 booking had been arranged as a comeback opportunity for Elvis, who had been receiving increasingly negative and worried reviews for his live performances over the past year. Critics had noted that he seemed confused on stage, forgot lyrics to his own most famous songs, appeared to be talking to people who weren't there, and sometimes seemed to be under the influence of something that affected his coordination, speech, and ability to connect with his audience. Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had assured Ed that Elvis was in good health and ready to deliver a performance that would remind America why he was called the King of Rock and Roll. The Colonel had insisted that the negative reviews were exaggerated, and that Elvis was simply going through a creative phase that would result in even better performances once he worked through whatever personal issues he was facing. But the reality that Ed encountered was far different from the Colonel's optimistic promises and assurances. From the moment Elvis arrived at CBS that afternoon, it was clear that he was in no condition to perform on national television or anywhere else. The warning signs had been apparent and alarming from the very beginning of Elvis's arrival at the studio. He had been helped out of his limousine by 2 bodyguards, suggesting that he was having serious difficulty walking on his own or maintaining his balance. His speech was noticeably slurred when he attempted to greet Ed's staff members, and his eyes had a glassy, unfocused quality that suggested he was heavily medicated with something much stronger than normal performance anxiety medication. His famous white jumpsuit, which had once been a symbol of his flamboyant stage presence, now looked like a costume being worn by someone playing the role of Elvis Presley rather than the genuine article. The suit hung loosely on his bloated frame, and there were visible stains that suggested he had been sweating profusely or had been sick before arriving at the studio. "Elvis looks really bad today," Ed's head producer had whispered to him after Elvis had been escorted to his dressing room by his security team. "I don't think he's in any condition to perform on live television. Maybe we should postpone this appearance until he's feeling better and can give the kind of performance that he and his fans deserve." But Ed had been reluctant to embarrass Elvis by canceling his appearance at the last minute, and he had hoped against hope that the King would be able to pull himself together for the performance as he had done so many times before throughout his career. Elvis had a well-earned reputation for being able to rise to the occasion when the cameras were rolling, even when he was struggling with serious personal problems or health issues that would have sidelined less dedicated performers. The crisis had begun 30 minutes before showtime when Elvis's bodyguards had approached Ed with obvious concern and panic. "Mr. Sullivan," one of them had said, his voice tight with worry, "we can't wake Elvis up. We've been trying for 10 minutes, and he's not responding to us. We don't know what to do." Ed had immediately rushed to Elvis's dressing room, fearing the worst. What he found when he opened the door was a scene of devastating tragedy. One of America's greatest entertainers reduced to a barely conscious shell of his former self. Elvis was slumped in his chair, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle, his breathing so shallow that Ed had to look closely to make sure he was still alive. The prescription bottles scattered across the table told the story. Demerol, Percodan, Valium, Placidale, and several other medications that Ed didn't recognize, but that were clearly powerful enough to render Elvis nearly unconscious. "Elvis," Ed said loudly, gently shaking the performer's shoulder. "Elvis, can you hear me?" Elvis's eyes fluttered open briefly, but they were completely unfocused and seemed unable to register Ed's presence. His speech, when he tried to respond, was so slurred as to be incomprehensible. Ed felt his heart break as he looked at this man who had been such a vital electric presence in American culture. This wasn't just drug abuse. This was slow-motion suicide, happening in real time, and everyone around Elvis seemed powerless to stop it. "How long has he been like this?" Ed demanded of the bodyguards. "He was pretty out of it when we picked him up at his hotel," one of them replied reluctantly. "He said he hadn't slept well and had taken some medication to help him relax before the show. But this is worse than usual." Ed realized he was facing one of the most difficult decisions of his television career. He could try to wake Elvis and put him on stage in his current condition, potentially exposing his drug problem to 60 million Americans and humiliating one of his oldest friends in the entertainment business. Or he could cancel the appearance and deal with the professional and personal consequences of that decision. "We need to get him medical attention," Ed said firmly. "This isn't just being tired or nervous. This is a medical emergency." But Elvis's bodyguards were resistant to calling paramedics, knowing that it would inevitably lead to public exposure of Elvis's drug problems and potentially end his career permanently. "Mr. Sullivan, if this gets out to the press, it'll destroy him," one bodyguard pleaded. "The Colonel will have our jobs and Elvis will never forgive us. Maybe if we just give him some coffee and let him rest for a while, he'll be able to perform." Ed looked at Elvis, who was now completely unconscious again, and felt a mixture of anger and despair. The people who were supposed to be protecting Elvis were more concerned about protecting their own positions than about getting him the help he clearly needed. "This man is dying," Ed said with quiet fury. "I don't care about your jobs or the Colonel's reaction or even Elvis's career. We're calling a doctor right now." Ed's decision to call for medical help probably saved Elvis's life that night. The doctor who responded was able to administer medication that counteracted some of the effects of the pills Elvis had taken, bringing him back to a state of semi-consciousness. But the experience revealed the full extent of Elvis's addiction and the systematic enabling that was allowing it to continue. The doctor explained to Ed that Elvis was taking a dangerous combination of medications that could easily prove fatal, and that his current condition suggested he had built up such a tolerance to these drugs that he needed increasingly large doses to achieve the same effect. "Mr. Sullivan," the doctor said privately, "this young man is in serious danger. The amount of medication in his system right now would kill most people. If he continues on this path, he won't survive much longer." When Elvis finally regained enough consciousness to speak coherently, his first concern was not his health, but whether he would be able to perform. "Ed," Elvis said weakly, "I'm sorry about this. I just needed something to help me calm down before the show. Sometimes the pressure gets to me, you know. But I can still perform. Just give me a few more minutes." Ed felt his heart breaking as he heard the desperation in Elvis's voice. Even in his current condition, Elvis was more worried about disappointing his audience than about the fact that he had nearly died from drug overdose. "Elvis, you're not performing tonight," Ed said gently, but firmly. "You need to go to a hospital and get proper medical treatment. This isn't about one television show. This is about your life." But Elvis became agitated at the suggestion of hospital, knowing that it would inevitably become public and damage his carefully maintained image as the king of rock and roll. "I can't go to a hospital," Elvis pleaded. "The press will find out, and it'll be front-page news everywhere. My fans will be devastated. My career will be over." Ed realized that Elvis was more terrified of losing his public image than he was of dying, which revealed the psychological prison that fame had created for him. The June 5, 1977, Ed Sullivan Show was broadcast without Elvis, with Ed explaining to the audience that the performer had become ill and was unable to appear. The official story was that Elvis had come down with the flu, but industry insiders quickly learned the truth about what had really happened. The incident marked the beginning of the end for Elvis. His drug use continued to escalate, and his performances became increasingly erratic and embarrassing. 2 months later, on August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died at Graceland from cardiac arrhythmia, caused by prescription drug abuse. Ed Sullivan was among those who spoke at Elvis's memorial service, focusing not on the tragic circumstances of his death, but on the joy and energy he had brought to American music during his prime years. "Elvis Presley was one of the most naturally gifted performers I ever knew," Ed said at the service. "But fame and success came with a price that ultimately cost him his life. The young man who revolutionized American music deserved better protection from the people who were supposed to care about him." In the years following Elvis's death, Ed often spoke about the responsibility that managers, record companies, and even television hosts had to protect performers from the destructive aspects of fame. "That night, when I found Elvis unconscious in his dressing room, taught me something about the dark side of the entertainment industry," Ed reflected in later interviews. "We create these larger-than-life figures, but we don't always take care of the human beings inside those public personas." Elvis was crying out for help, but everyone around him was more interested in preserving his earning potential than in preserving his life. The story of Elvis's near-fatal overdose backstage at the Ed Sullivan Show became part of the tragic narrative of his final years, illustrating how prescription drug addiction had destroyed one of America's greatest entertainers while the people around him enabled his self-destruction. Ed's decision to call for medical help, rather than trying to prop Elvis, Ed's decision to call for medical help, rather than trying to prop Elvis up for a performance, represented one of his most morally courageous moments, choosing human decency over television ratings. If this tragic story moved you, hit that subscribe button and tell us how can we better protect talented people from the destructive pressures of fame. Sometimes the people who bring us the most joy are the ones who need the most help.